Good afternoon, everyone. Today is April 21st, 2026, and welcome to my YouTube channel, The Political Report. Today in this video, I wanted to go over and talk about the 2026 U.S. Senate election in the state of Alaska. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, the U.S. Senate election in the state of Alaska for 2026 really just started to get interesting at the end of 2025. Now, at the end of 2025, there were reports and rumors going around that U.S. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer on the Democratic side was nudging multiple Democrats around the country to announce their bid for U.S. Senate races in 2026 for the Democratic nominations. And one of the main figures he's been nudging the entire year in 2025 was U.S. former Representative Mary Peltola of the state of Alaska. Now, the news broke on January 12, 2026, when Mary Peltola ended up announcing her U.S. Senate bid in the state of Alaska and jumped into the primary race for the nomination in Alaska's Senate race. Now, in this article, it goes over how former Representative Mary Peltola launched her Senate campaign with an Alaska First message. She is seen as a blue dog centrist Democrat in the state of Alaska that can truly represent independent Alaskans' minds in the U.S. Senate, and is not just a Democrat blue vote that you can see across the U.S. Senate, and is not a Republican red vote that you can see in the U.S. Senate. Instead, she wants to give off this image of a moderate, appealing blue dog Democrat that Alaska should vote for because of its independent qualities. In the 2026 election, she will be facing two-term incumbent Senator Dan Sullivan on the Republican side. Now, Dan Sullivan himself is a veteran when it comes to these hard and competitive elections. Matter of fact, if you go all the way back to 2014, Dan Sullivan's U.S. Senate career began in one of the most contested and toss-up races in the red wave of 2014. Dan Sullivan was going up against a political dynasty in the state of Alaska. He was going up against Mark Bajec, which was the moderate Democratic senator of the state of Alaska, who ended up winning in 2008, riding some of the coattails of Obama's landslide in 2008, and he ran for re-election in 2014. Dan Sullivan began his U.S. Senate career by unseating and beating Democrat Senator Mark Bajec in 2014. Now, in the polls, this showed this being a neck-and-neck and a toss-up race where Dan Sullivan was only leading by around 1 percentage point in some of these polls, and 6 percentage points Mark Bajec had a chance of beating Dan Sullivan in some of these polls. So this was really a toss-up race that was ever so tilting to the Republican side, and Dan Sullivan ended up squeaking out a very competitive and tough election in 2014, that although it was a red wave in the state of Alaska, waves don't happen all of the time, and Dan Sullivan ended up beating a hard Democratic incumbent, Mark Bajec. And then in 2020, this happened again because he was running against a independent/Democratic candidate. Now, this would have been a lot closer if the race was actually truly against independent candidate, but as you can see here in the New York Times article I'm about to pull up, is that when Dan Sullivan ended up running against Al Gross, it ended up showing that Al Gross was nominated by the Democratic Party on the ballot. So when voters went to vote on their ballot in 2020, when most of them ended up voting for Trump instead of Biden at the state of Alaska, they saw that they were voting for the U.S. Senate as well, and they saw that Al Gross was a Democrat and Dan Sullivan was a Republican, and therefore Dan Sullivan ended up winning by nearly 13 percentage points. So Al Gross basically got none of the benefits of being an independent, none of the benefits of being a Democrat, and instead got all of the baggage of being a Democrat in the state of Alaska, where a lot of Alaskan voters just saw the name Democratic Party and decided not to vote for him because Alaska is traditionally, although more independent, it is still somewhat of a red state. And Al Gross ended up losing by a wider margin than expected because he received the Democrat Party's nomination. Moving back to this election, it was actually projected that Dan Sullivan would actually be in a lot closer of a possession. Gravis Marketing gave Dan Sullivan, only a winning margin of 3 percentage points. Public policy polling, a Democratic internal gave him a 3 percentage point lead. Change Research, an independent Democrat internal, only gave him a 3 percentage point lead. But at the end of the day, he ended up winning by nearly 13 percentage points. And all of those were somewhat biased and leaning pollsters, but for some of the more independent pollsters like New York Times, you could see that it's an 8 percentage lead that they gave Dan Sullivan, which is closer to the actual margin. But you can see here Alaska Survey Research ended up giving Dan Sullivan only a 4-point lead when he ended up winning by nearly 14, which is a 10-point Democratic bias that Alaska Survey Research ended up giving Dan Sullivan. Now, why is this 10-point bias important? Because as you can see here when it comes to the general election in November, that Alaska Survey Research is the primary poller for the head-to-head between Dan Sullivan and Mary Peltola. Now, in 2023, they have a very old poll to give Mary Peltola a lead at the height of her political career when she was winning all of those special elections and general elections in 2022. But moving forward closer to the end of 2025, we can actually see Alaska Survey Research and Data for Progress began to ramp up their polling because they were hearing rumors and news reports that Mary Peltola was preparing to announce her bid. Now, she did ultimately end up announcing her bid on July 12th, as previously mentioned, and around the weeks of January, and March 19th, 2022 to 2026, we have 2 polls from Alaska Survey Research and 1 from Public Policy Polling, which is a Democratic internal that all show Mary Peltola winning at various different margins. They show her winning by 2 percentage points, 2 percentage points, and when you get rid of all the undecided and all of the third parties and all of the other candidates, they show Mary Peltola ultimately winning by around 4 percentage points. Now, interestingly enough, the poll showing her winning by 4 percentage points is the exact same poll that overestimated Democrats by 10 points in 2020. So you should take these with a grain of salt. However, Alaska Survey Research is one of the only pollsters we have here, so we should still consider their opinion, although the previous past polling results show that they do have a somewhat significant Democratic bias within them. Now, what are the actual chances of these candidates winning? When you look at the fundraising, you can see that they're nearly head-to-head and identical. Now, the issue with this is Mary Peltola has only been running for around 90 days, whereas Dan Sullivan has announced his re-election for multiple years now, and Dan Sullivan's re-election campaign essentially started right after November 2024. So where Dan Sullivan has had around a year and a half to fundraise, Mary Peltola has only had 90 days. And in the 90 days, what do we see? Mary Peltola has essentially closed the entire gap. Moving over to the FEC filings, we can see that for the coverage ending on March 31st for the first quarter of 2026, that Mary Peltola nearly erased the entire lead that Dan Sullivan had in the fundraising. Now, these numbers are not the most accurate because they only show the campaign's fundraising numbers. These do not include external party groups like the DSCC, the Democrat Senatorial Committee, or the Republican Senatorial Committee that are going to dump tens and hundreds of millions of dollars into this race because of how competitive it is. What are the national implications of this race? If Mary Peltola is actually able to pick off that Senate race here in Alaska, this could end up helping Democrats drastically. Looking on the map here of the 2026 U.S. Senate elections, where you give all of the solid states a safe rating, all of the likely states a likely rating, and the tilt states a tilt rating. Nebraska, ultimately Republicans are favored to win. Osborne is not going to win the election in Nebraska unless a massive scandal for Republicans that would lead them to underperforming by around 20 percentage points just because of an independent candidate, which won't happen. Iowa is almost certainly going to go Republican. Florida is going to go Republican. South Carolina is going to go Republican. The only 2 states that might be tilt or somewhat lean Republican will be Ohio, where Sherrod Brown is running against John Husted, but John Husted has been a statewide name brand in Ohio politics for nearly 30 years. So Republicans here in the state of Ohio should probably still be winning this race against Sherrod Brown, who ended up losing as a 3-term incumbent against Bernie Moreno in 2024, and he lost by around 6 entire percentage points. So with that being said, I don't really think Democrats should be vying all their hopes in Ohio. Neither should they be vying all their hopes in Texas, where they're spending around $120 million just on James Talarico himself. Now, James Talarico, although he's seen a surge in popularity because he is the Democrat Christian that's going to be the Christian voice in Democrat Texas politics that's going to win over all of these MAGA and Republican voters by his Christian antics, isn't really going to happen in the state of Texas. There is virtually no shot that a Democrat in an entire November general election will overperform in a state by enough to outwin Trump's 15-point winning margin in 2024. In a 2-year cycle between 2024 to now, we aren't going to see a Democrat do an entire 17-point shift within just 2 years, especially if it's against incumbent John Cornyn. Now, John Cornyn is always an overperformer in his races, and even if it is Ken Paxton, I can still see Paxton winning the race by a few percentage points. Now, this is why Alaska is so vital, because if you give the states to the Republicans and you give Democrats the states where they're currently leading in the polls, so for all the other toss-ups, Michigan, North Carolina, Georgia, New Hampshire, and Maine, where they're actually leading the polls, you can give it to them and we end up with a 50-50 race splitting the U.S. Senate. It's actually not a 50-50 race, it's actually a 49-50 race leaving Alaska, where if Mary Peltola is actually able to pick it off, like in the scenario we're talking about, it will make it 50-50. And in these instances, it will be J.D. Vance needing to be the tie-breaking vote in every single Senate passage for Republicans to actually have the majority. Now, Republicans actually have their own issues getting all their voters on board. As previously mentioned, U.S. Senator Lisa Murkowski is a rhino in the state of Alaska, where she consistently votes with and sides with the Democrats on a lot of key issues and ends up betraying or voting against the Republicans on a lot of their key issues. So you can very easily see a Democrat like Lisa Murkowski switching parties and making this a 51-49 lead, where Democrats could actually take back the Senate majority in 2026 with Mary Peltola. So the national party implications here are huge for Mary Peltola. Now, ultimately, what do I think for the 2026 predictions? What do I think will happen at the end of the day? I think Mary Potoa is at a very good spot right now. All of the polls show her winning by around a few percentage points, although these polls should be taken with a grain of salt as a Democrat winning in the state of Alaska. Mary Potoa would be that unicorn candidate that is the only one, literally the only one in the state of Alaska that can make this happen. At the current moment, with the current state of the United States, with Trump's approval rating continuing to fall, as of right now in April of 2026, I would say that Mary Potoa is favored to win this race by around 1 percentage points, and I actually think that this race would be the closest Senate race in the 2026 cycle, and I predict that the margin will be around 1 percentage point at the current moment. However, there's a long time between now and November. There's a long time between now and August if we look toward a primary election. And the primary election in August will give us a good picture as to who will win, because the primary election is a nonpartisan blanket primary, so everyone's on the same ballot. So we could very easily see in August if Mary Potoa has an unsurmountable lead and if the polls are accurate. And if the polls are not accurate, we can see Dan Sullivan pick up the slack and tie and or beat Mary Potoa just in the primary. So I think the primary election will probably be the time where we can give a more accurate prediction, but I would say as of now, I would have to disagree with a lot of these pollster ratings. I think that Mary Potoa would probably win this election by around 1 percentage point at the current moment. So go ahead and let me know what you think down below in the comments. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think Dan Sullivan will end up winning the U.S. Senate election? Or do you think Mary Potoa would end up winning the Senate election? What do you think will happen in this race? Do you think that we'll see any of these signs in the U.S. primary here in the U.S. Senate election for Alaska? Or do you think the primary results don't matter for what the general results would be? Please go ahead and like the video down below if you enjoyed. Please click this playlist right here if you're interested in U.S. governor elections for the 2026 cycle. And stay tuned for more videos later this week, as I will be uploading a video tomorrow on the Virginia redistricting referendum. Thank you all for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.